Really excited to be here to introduce our speaker, Judy. We're going to be having an opportunity to listen to Diane virtually. And many of you probably know who Diane Ravitch is. In fact, I want to quickly see a show of hands. How many of you have read an article or a book by Diane Ravitch? All right, we have a fan club here. I love it. Diane Ravitch is someone that I was able to meet 2 years ago when I went to my first ever public education conference in Philadelphia. And I was so pleased. My brother was jealous. He's worked in education for 30 years as well in San Antonio. And he said, "Oh, you need to meet my idol." And I said, "Yes." And I got my picture and I was all bubbly and excited. It was just amazing. Diane is a true treasure, a legend, a wonderful person in so many ways. She speaks from the heart and from her mind, which is brilliant. We are so lucky. When I emailed her and I said, "Please, would you consider joining us at this summit, because we're trying to bring people together from so many different groups who care about public education." She said yes immediately, and she was available with all the things that she does. Diane's resume, of course, is voluminous, as we all know, and since you're very familiar with her, she has over 150,000 followers on her Twitter page, which many of you follow, and if you follow it, you'll know that she doesn't just keep up with education. She follows the world as it is, and she lets us know what's happening in a positive and proactive way. That's what's so wonderful about her. She almost daily in her blog. If you have not seen her blog, you should, because it gives you an opportunity to catch up on what's happening with the world. She is amazing in that regard. My dear friend and mentor, Jeannie Kaplan, was a good friend of Diane's. They met in 2010, which was 14 years ago, when Diane was touring the country for her book tour for the death and life of the great American school system, how testing and choice are undermining education. What a title that is even today. Jeannie was a staunch supporter of public schools when she served on the DPS school board for 8 years, and she too wrote a blog that Diane often republished on her site. When Jeannie died last November, Diane shared a beautiful tribute to her, describing in her own words how they were fast friends as soon as they met. She also mentioned how Jeannie was a crusader for civil rights, who called out the false flag that charter interests flew in Denver as they pretended to care about equity. How many of you, well, you mentioned how many of you have heard about Diane. For those of you who know her, you know that our education world is a much improved place because of her undying commitment to children, to educators, to parents, and to communities. And that to me is so important to keep in mind. Diane Ravitch is the author of over a dozen books, including 3 bestsellers, 500 articles and reviews for scholarly publications. She was a professor at the Columbia University Teachers College, the former Assistant Secretary of Education, founder and president of the Network for Public Education, which has been working to bring together advocates from all over the country to inform the public about the values of public education since 2013. She has numerous awards and honorary degrees. She's a graduate of the Houston Public Schools, received her BA from Wellesley College, and her PhD from Columbia. I'm honored today to be able to introduce her to you, and I'm going to be facilitating a conversation with Diane, but we invite you to join us. You have cards in your folders, if you would. Feel free to write down a question or two if you wish, and then there'll be people who will be collecting them. Let's see who the people are who are going to be collecting them. Okay, Phil, get ready, and then we can, in about 15, 20 minutes or so after we have a conversation with Diane as the time goes, because we're trying to stay on schedule, which I know is always hard with technical difficulties, we will collect your questions and I'll ask her some of those as well. So, but I would like you to join with me when we put her on the screen. Let's give her a big, as a group, a big welcome to Colorado. Welcome.
Wonderful. I want to begin by saying how much I miss Jeannie Kaplan. Whenever I came to Denver, we spent time together. She was truly a soulmate. I loved her very much. And she shared my passion for reclaiming public schools from the privatizers. As you all may know, I was on the other side for a long time. And I learned so much about the failures of what my side was advocating that I changed my mind. And that seemed to be an epic thing at the time. That was in around 2008, 2009. And I was writing articles that were critical of the reforms. But when my book came out, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education, it was, for many people, a great shock. And the Wall Street Journal asked me to write an op-ed about why I had done such a dramatic thing as to change my mind. And other publications said, how could you do this? And I was on the Jon Stewart show, which was wonderful. And I got a lot of both positive and negative attention. My former friends turned their backs on me, which I expected because I disagreed with them. I realized, based on having been on the inside, that charter schools were failing, that there were tremendous scandals in the charter industry. And this is of somewhat Colorado interest. I was invited by Rosa DeLauro, who's a congresswoman from Connecticut, and she's the lead appropriator for education. And she invited me to come to Washington and speak to the House Education Committee. And I brought a copy of my book, and the whole House Education Committee was there. And one member of the committee, who is from Colorado, had already read my book. And I was about to talk about how charters and vouchers were not going to improve education, and how testing had gotten out of control. And this member from Colorado is your governor. He threw my book across the table and told me it was the worst book he'd ever read. I think it was because he had opened 2 charter schools himself.
Yep.
And as I understand it, he continues to be a supporter of charters. My view from early on, and I'm talking about from the time that I changed my mind, which would have been around 2008 when I started writing that book, was that charters were failing, that the few that had higher scores than public schools were curating their student body. They were accepting the kids they wanted and pushing out or not accepting the kids they didn't want. They had a significantly lower percentage of kids with disabilities than public schools. And they were not doing better. Many of them were doing far worse, except for that small number that was managing to get the high-scoring kids and keep out the low-scoring kids. So I became very down on charter schools. I did not think it was a solution to anything. And I realized that charter schools were contributing to the defunding of education. And this great myth was growing based on one idea. And that idea was, our schools are failing, try anything. So it was in my second book in that series, Reign of Error, where I dug deep into the test scores. And of course, the idea that our public schools are failing begins in 1983 with the Reagan-era report, A Nation at Risk. And it's a very negative portrayal of education, and it talks about a rising tide of mediocrity. And states all over the country started setting up commissions and study groups, and what are we going to do about our failing public schools? So that very major federal publication was actually a great lie. And at the last meeting of the Network for Public Education, which was in DC, James Harvey, who was a member of our board, happened to have been a staff member for the commission that wrote that report. And he's a staunch supporter of public schools. And he said when they wrote the report, it was not a lambasting attack on public schools. Instead, it was a balanced report about the challenges of public schools in a time of tremendous demographic change, the addition of kids with disabilities who had been excluded in the past. And he thought it was a very balanced report, but he said there was 1 or 2 commission members who literally rewrote the report to make it the downer that it was. But he said that negative slant to the report was not what the report originally was supposed to say. The way he put it was, his name is James Harvey, and I think if you Google his name and this title, you'll find his article. They cooked the books. They cooked the books by looking for every negative thing they could in terms of test scores or anything they could find to make a case against public schools. And this gave rise to the testing movement. As we know, George W. Bush came to Washington with claims of a Texas miracle. When he was elected, he ran as a compassionate conservative. And he said that the Texas schools had completely turned around because of testing and accountability. and he said that when you test kids every child every year, incredibly wonderful things happen. But at the time, there were only a couple of academics that didn't have a platform that said that wasn't true. There was no Texas Miracle, but there continued to be. The media accepted this. They really don't ever report very well on education. So they accepted that there had been a Texas Miracle, and it all came about because of testing and accountability. And the idea was that if you encourage people to get higher scores, the teachers will work harder. And if you punish them by cutting their funding or doing something else to them, they will work harder still. So Bush brought that to the nation, and Congress was all in for it. More Democrats voted for it than Republicans. And we began to get this very muscular federal role in education that had not existed before. We had always had some federal involvement in education, but it was funding, not directing the ship and not telling individual schools what to do. And it was since the passage of No Child Left Behind that schools across the country were required to test every child every year. And because the stakes became higher with each passing year, the way NCLB was written, there were punishments if you didn't raise your scores. Within 14 years, every student was supposed to be considered proficient or to test proficient, and that was an impossible goal. And I remember going to a meeting at one of the hotels, one of the very fancy hotels in Washington, D.C., and there was a panel of senators talking about how great No Child Left Behind was and would be. And one of them was my former boss. I had worked in the Department of Education during the first Bush administration, and my former boss was Lamar Alexander, the senator from Tennessee. And at the end of the presentation about how wonderful NCLB was, I stood up and asked a question. I said, Senator Alexander, do you really expect that all children will be proficient at the end of 14 years? And he said, well, no, but it's a goal, and it's good to have goals. Well, he didn't believe in it. Nobody else believed in it. But if schools were not making progress towards that goal, there were punishments. If you weren't on track towards raising every single child to proficiency, the punishments got harsher each year. And in the 5th year of not meeting that goal, your school might be closed, the staff might be replaced completely, your school might be turned into a charter school, handed over to private management. It's just a long list of bad things that would happen to your school on the theory that every child in America would be proficient. It didn't matter that there's no nation in the world where every child is proficient. And so the school struggled through 14 years of No Child Left Behind, with schools being taken over, schools being closed, more charter schools opening. And all through this, the charter industry began to get stronger and stronger because, to go back just for a second, in 1994, President Clinton wrote into federal law a small program called the Federal Charter Schools Program. And that program was funded with something like $6 million. But what happened was that the charter school sector became not just another school sector, it became an industry. And the charter school industry had very good lobbyists working for them in DC. And they fought year after year to increase that small $6 million program. It's now $400 million a year. The federal government, the Federal Department of Education, is the single largest funder of charter schools. And they fund terrible chains, chains that are already very rich, chains that are supported by billionaires, chains like KIPP, and in New York we have Success Academy, which has several billionaires on its board. These are schools that don't need additional money, but the money is there because it's there, and when it's there it gets distributed. Even under Cardona, right now, the Department of Education has been handing out millions of dollars to right-wing charter schools. They just recently gave a grant to what they call a Barney School, which is connected to right-wing Hillsdale College in Cincinnati. It's 98% white, and they applied for $2 million to expand. They're in the suburbs of Cincinnati, and they got $2 million from the Biden Department of Education. This did not have to happen because the rules are very clear that a charter school grant must not worsen segregation. Well, if you're 98% white, you're certainly not promoting diversity. It also recently gave out grants to 2 Academica for-profit charter schools. Academica is one of the richest chains in the United States, started in Florida. Again, a charter school that did not need federal money. And yet, every year, the Department of Education hands out the money, in part because there were Democrats like Jared Polis who were fooled by the charter lobby into thinking that this was a very liberal idea to create alternative privately managed schools that would save children. So going forward to 2015, the federal government, or the Congress, rewrites the law. It's no longer called No Child Left Behind. It's called Every Student Succeeds Act. Now, there's something fundamentally wrong about naming legislation for its goal. I guess it may be, human nature to say, to pass a law saying the Clean Air Act will eliminate all bad air. But it hasn't happened in education. We cannot say that No Child Left Behind left no child behind. In fact, the achievement gaps continue, the underfunding of public education continues, and many, many children have been left behind, the same children who were left behind in 2000. And the other thing to know about all of this, and I go into it in my book, is in the first book, there was never a Texas miracle. Texas is not a high-performing state. And Texas has hundreds of charter schools now, and the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, is pushing very, very hard for vouchers. And thus far, he has been stymied mainly because of rural Republicans. The Republican Party in Texas has a supermajority in both houses of the legislature, but they have stopped vouchers because of the rural Republicans. Well, Governor Abbott may have eliminated the roadblock because he primaried every Republican who opposed vouchers, and he was funded by out-of-state billionaires. One of the things I did in my last book, Slaying Goliath, is to name all the Republican billionaires who were supporting reform as we've come to know it, and particularly vouchers. The richest man in Pennsylvania is a trucker named Jeff Yass, Y-A-S-S, and Jeff Yass gave $6 million, which is like couch change. Jeff Yass gave $6 million to Governor Greg Abbott to eliminate those moderate Republicans who want to stop vouchers because they know that their teachers, their community public schools are the heart of their community. It's their aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews who are teaching in those schools, and they don't have any private schools in their community anyway. Why would they want vouchers? Because they know that when vouchers, if they're ever passed in Texas, there'll be less funding for public schools. But we'll see what happens in this session of the legislature, because Greg Abbott, with the help of billionaire Jeff Yass, has done a good job of knocking off moderate Republicans. But going forward to the Every Student Succeeds Act, the Republicans were, in 2015, were willing to drop the federal requirement of every child must be tested every year. It's really a very stupid and useless requirement, and I go into why it's a useless requirement in my book. The results come in too late to be useful. They rank students. They don't give information to teachers about students that they're actually teaching. They give them information about last year's students, and the information is so limited. It's really, I liken it to going to the doctor and getting a diagnosis, and the doctor says to you, I will tell you the diagnosis in 6 months. Well, in 6 months you might be dead, but the diagnosis just says you're in the bottom 20%, you're in the top 30%. It ranks and rates you, but it doesn't say what's needed. So the teacher doesn't learn anything other than your rank. So the testing as it's now constructed is ridiculous. David Berliner at the University of Arizona, who's one of the great researchers of our time, has said that the federal government might change the law to say test every 3 years, that they'd get just as much information as they do now, and maybe even more, because there's nothing to be gained from testing every student every year. But Arne Duncan, who was Obama's Secretary of Education, found something worse to do than No Child Left Behind. When he came in, he developed a program called Race to the Top, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But Race to the Top required every state to have charter schools if they wanted to compete for $4 billion, their share of $4 billion. And so they had to have charter schools. They had to, as the law says, test every student every year. And they had to evaluate teachers and principals in schools based on the changes in test scores. If the scores went up, the teachers were good. If the scores didn't go up, the teachers were not good. And if the scores went down between this year's class and last year's class, you were a very bad teacher, a very bad student, a very bad school, very bad principal. And so Duncan totally bought into this idea that you could use carrots and sticks and beat the teachers into raising test scores. It was a disaster. Colorado, I think, was the first state to adopt a very harsh and punitive program. I happened to be in Colorado again for a book visit on the day that Mike Johnson told the legislature that this was absolutely the way to go, that it would lead to dramatic improvement in schools and in professionals. And I was supposed to have a debate with him before a civic group in Denver, and he managed to arrive exactly as I finished, so he didn't get a chance to hear anything I had to say, because I was taking apart his belief that carrots and sticks would lead to dramatic improvement. Well, it didn't, and it hasn't, and it didn't make any difference in the state of Colorado, but he continues to believe that that was a wonderful thing. I don't think there are any teachers in America who believe it was a wonderful thing. Another time when I was in Denver, and Jeannie was my host, I was supposed to speak at the University of Colorado. And the day that I was to speak, the Denver Post published an editorial saying that I was a political speaker, and the University of Colorado could not host me on its campus. So the whole meeting was shifted to a church, and I think the whole meeting was actually packed with teachers. I got a wonderful reception and was able to say what I wanted to say, regardless of the Denver Post. So I've had lots of experiences, interesting, unforgettable experiences in Denver and in Boulder and other places in Colorado. But back to the main story. Note the race to the top by incentivizing test scores, and is more important than anything else, led to teachers being ranked by test score gains. And what we learned from that was that these rankings were highly ineffective and inefficient. And the Los Angeles Times developed its own ranking system based on test scores, and two reporters printed a story that included the scores of every teacher in LA as to whether they were effective or ineffective or somewhere in between. One teacher, a man named Rigoberto Roelas, who was teaching in a very tough district, committed suicide because of his ranking. I mean, he was doing the best he could, it wasn't good enough for the Los Angeles Times, and he jumped off a bridge and killed himself. It was a really stupid idea, because education statisticians, social scientists warned Duncan, warned the administration that the test score gains and losses were not a function of the teacher. The teacher affected about 10 to 15% of the students' test scores, but the much larger impact on test scores was out-of-school influences, specifically whether they came to school hungry, whether they had a stable roof over their head, whether they had access to medical care. In other words, whether their family was affluent or poor. If they were poor, their handicaps were multiply increased. If they were affluent and their parents had rich conversations at dinner, got them a library card, traveled, talked at dinner table, large vocabulary, etc., they got high scores. And very little of it had to do with, with what the teacher did in school. It had to do with the socioeconomics of the classroom. And so teachers who taught in affluent districts looked like terrific teachers, and other teachers, those who taught the kids with handicaps, those who taught kids who were English language learners, appeared to be bad teachers when they just had a tough classroom of kids that had other priorities. And some of them didn't do their homework, and some of them didn't show up and had high absenteeism rates and so forth. I recall in New York City, the New York Post, which is a Rupert Murdoch publication, published a list of teachers based on their student test scores. And two things stuck out. One was the teachers who had classes that were gifted classes were very, very poorly ranked because their scores didn't go up. If they were at the top last year, they were still at the top, which means they didn't see the gains that the algorithm predicted. And so there were extremely talented teachers who were given bad ratings. The other thing was that the New York Post ratings identified one teacher in particular and said she was the worst teacher in all of New York City. And the reporters went to her home. She wasn't there. They went to her father's home. They banged on the door. They said they wanted to interview the worst teacher in New York City. Well, they couldn't locate her, fortunately. And when the full story came out, it turns out she was a teacher of kids who were cycling in and out of the public schools. They were kids who had arrived from another country, and many of them didn't speak English. And when they had mastered enough English, they transferred out of her class, sometimes in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. She had a constantly rotating group of students, so the kids who were tested last year and this year were all kids who were transitory kids. It was a really stupid, spiteful, mean rating. I mean, Duncan should have been driven out of office for the terrible things he said about teachers and for the ridiculous things he said about charter schools. I remember at one point I wrote an article in the New York Times and trying to debunk the idea that there were miracle schools and showing that many of these charter schools that claimed to be miraculous were simply screening their kids. And the same with public schools. When people were given huge bonuses to get higher scores, they miraculously got higher scores, and then the next year the scores went back down to where they had been, and the principal returned along the way. So we've really been through 40 years of demeaning public schools and 20 years of, actually 23 years of terrible public policy that has been created in a way that demoralizes teachers and that diminishes the role of public schools and that encourages privatization. The fact that both Democratic and Republican members of Congress have kept the federal charter school program alive year after year, constantly pushing for more money, is a disgrace. What I did, and I have this series of 3 books. The second one was called Reign of Error. It was a national bestseller. Reign of Error was my effort to disprove every single thing the reformers said. And on the question of whether our schools were failing, I looked at the grades on national tests over the previous 20, 30, 40 years, and it was very clear that the test scores at that time were higher than they had ever been in history for every group, for every racial and ethnic group. And that didn't seem to faze the reformers who wanted to keep up the drumbeat of schools are failing. And I'm sure you remember the infamous movie, Waiting for Superman. It was a terrible movie. It was filled with propaganda for charter schools and demeaned the role and importance and value of public schools. And it had the authority, it had the imprimatur and the funding from Bill Gates and also Philip Anschutz, one of your Colorado billionaires. But after that movie appeared, I reviewed it in the New York Review of Books, and pointed out something that continues to be used by reformers to this day to lie about public schools. And you'll see this, for example, on the website of Moms for Liberty, this group that is in favor of vouchers and censorship and not teaching accurate history. Moms for Liberty says, the scandal of our schools is that 1/3 of our kids are not reading on grade level. This is a lie. The way they're defining grade level is NAEP proficient. I was on the NAEP board, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. NAEP is a federal testing program. I was appointed to the board by Bill Clinton right before he left office. And what I learned was that NAEP proficient is a very, very high bar. The highest level you can rate on NAEP is advanced. That's for kids who are really like A+++. And the second level is NAEP proficient, which is a solid A. Below that is NAEP basic, and NAEP basic is great. To me, it's grade level, right there. Every year, since NAEP has created these achievement levels, the majority of children, the great majority of children, 65 or 70%, are above basic, which is about what you'd expect to find, because the ones who are below basic are the kids who are the poorest, kids with certain kinds of special needs, kids who don't speak English, and we should be working to raise those kids at the bottom up. But instead, the NAEP proficient has become misinterpreted to mean grade level. It is not grade level. It is a solid A. So when Moms for Liberty say that 2/3 of our kids can't read on grade level, they're simply lying. They don't know what NAEP proficient is. Now, I started off by talking about my review of Waiting for Superman. I pointed out that the biggest error in that movie is that they use data based on NAEP, and their data assumes, or their description of the data assumes, that NAEP proficient is grade level. And that's simply wrong. Our schools are doing as good a job as they ever did under very difficult circumstances, given the fact that there are so many different language groups, so many kids living in poverty, so many families struggling to get by. And if we really want, I've come to believe this very strongly and had a lot to do with my change of heart, and that is if we really want to reform education, you begin by making sure that kids have access to medical care and access to the things in life that most of us consider basic to a decent life. In Reign of Error, I not only responded to all of the claims of the reform movement, which are all lies, and disproved them by data, but I had I think it was, I don't forget if it was 17, 18, 19 sections of the book devoted to what we should be doing instead. And the first thing, and I tried to do it as a kind of a life cycle description, attending to maternal health. When you look at the United Nations figures for which countries have the best maternal health outcomes, we are something like number 40. We're not up there with other advanced nations. We're down with third world nations that don't have resources. And many women die because they don't have access to maternal care during their pregnancy. Many women give birth to children who have special needs, who could have been born completely healthy had they had access to the proper treatment when they were pregnant. So that's my first suggestion, backed up by data, about what a disgraceful situation we have in relationship to maternal health. And I went on with other suggestions having to do with young children, early childhood education, things we should be doing in the schools to make sure that every child has access to certified teachers, to good schools with a rich curriculum, that we reduce the testing so that kids are tested periodically but not every year, and that children and students in schools are not held accountable for year-to-year variations in test scores, because that's turning the measure into the goal. And one thing that we know from social science is that when the measure becomes the goal, you corrupt the measure. You're no longer measuring what you think you are. And what happens is, and I go into this in some detail, is that the curriculum is narrowed, meaning that schools drop the arts, They drop all kinds of courses, in some cases science, civics, physical education. States have to pass laws to bring back recess, for God's sakes, because all of these things get dropped out and replaced by test prep. And it used to be that test prep was considered unethical because you want to know what kids know and can do. You don't want to know how much access they have to test prep or how many hours they spent poring over how to get a higher grade or higher test score. So there are a lot of recommendations there, including reducing class size. Reducing class size turns out to be one of the most important ways to improve the tone, the atmosphere, the teaching, children's attention, reducing discipline problems, and ultimately probably raising test scores, but I wouldn't make that the measure. Reducing class size is very important. So where we are today is that Biden has, I'm clearly not supporting Donald Trump. He would, I don't care if he abolishes the Department of Education, but I do care that the federal government continues to fund education and stop funding charter schools. Before there was the Federal Department of Education, many of the same programs existed, but they were in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So I don't really care where the programs are, but I would like to stop having secretaries of education who don't support public schools. I would say that
You got a response, a positive response from that comment. Keep going.
Okay, I can't hear the room, thank you. I would say that Cardona has been a tremendous disappointment, and I may be the only person to say this publicly other than people on the other side. I think he has not stood up for public schools. We have seen in the last 2 years the most dramatic expansion of vouchers ever, and I can't remember hearing him say anything about it. I don't remember a major address from him. I do remember him going to be the keynote speaker for the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And as I told you, I've always thought that charter schools were a step on the road to vouchers, and we're there now. The reform crowd has now put all of its marbles into universal vouchers. And I just read a wonderful book, which I recommend to you. It's coming out this month. And the book by Josh Cowen, C-O-W-E-N, is called The Privateers: How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. I mean, vouchers are the hopes of our time. The kids who take vouchers, most of them never went to public schools. Most of them, in every state that has passed a voucher program, between 65 to 80, even 90% of the kids who got vouchers were already attending a private school or a religious school. And I recognize that religious schools are private schools, but religious schools have really, what happens is a lot of these kids are going to schools where they're not being taught the best science or the best history. They're being indoctrinated. So it's something kind of amazing that Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, says, I don't want indoctrination, I want education. And then he encourages vouchers where the whole specific purpose of religious schools is indoctrination. And the religious schools, once the kids get a voucher, they are no longer subject to federal rules and regulations, and so they can discriminate at will, and they do. Many of the voucher schools exclude children with disabilities. That leads, and I just saw that recently in Milwaukee numbers, where there are 3 sectors: the charters, the vouchers, and the public schools. The public schools have a much, much higher percentage of kids with disabilities because the other schools don't want them. The voucher schools can exclude children based on the religion. They're allowed to say, we only take kids who are our religion. We are fill in the blanks. We're this kind of religion, and those are the kids we'll take. We won't take everyone. They almost, I won't say universally, a very large number of the voucher schools will not accept children who are LGBT or whose families are, and will not hire staff who are LGBT. They also do not have to accept kids with disabilities. They're under no requirement, because once parents take vouchers, their children are no longer protected by federal law, IDEA, and all the provisions that exist to protect children with disabilities. So what we're seeing right now in states like Florida and Arizona and Ohio and other states is the disassembling of public schools. It's still the case that the majority of kids attend public schools, but those schools are increasingly defunded to make room for the alternative schools. And what Josh Cowan shows in his book is that the kids who take vouchers, who are coming from public schools, are not saved. In fact, they lose ground. So we're not putting out vouchers to save poor kids from failing public schools. We actually have children who go from a public school in their neighborhood to a private or religious school, and over a period of a year, 2 years, 3 years, they see a steady decline in their academic performance. And many of them go back to public schools, but when they get back to public schools, they're behind. So we're funding an inferior public voucher program, and now in about half the states, old red states, it's unfortunately become a kind of a Republican tenet of their party that all schools must have school choice. All children must have choice between charters, vouchers, or homeschooling. And in many of the states, homeschooling is funded by the taxpayer. So this is a dramatic attack on the principle of public education. And I probably shouldn't have to tell you this, but public education has played a very important role in the history of our country. It is the place where there are battles for rights, which until now have always been won, where the desegregation movement started. The voucher movement was a response to desegregation. At that time, the vouchers were for white kids fleeing desegregation, and that's where the voucher movement got its start. So when there are universal vouchers, what that means is that there's no income limit. And that's the goal of the people like Ron DeSantis in Florida and Greg Abbott and other Republican governors, and for that matter, Donald Trump, is to remove the income limits, in which case rich kids get vouchers and poor kids get an inferior education. They are not being accepted into elite private schools. Instead, the kids in elite private schools are getting vouchers to subsidize their tuition. And many of these schools are raising their tuition to reflect the fact that the kids now have more money to spend from the state. So it's a win-win for the private sector and a lose-lose for the public sector. So we're at I think, a major inflection point. I'm very encouraged about Tim Walz being alongside Kamala Harris, because he absolutely refused to agree to vouchers in Minnesota. Minnesota has a lot of charter schools, which he had nothing to do with. And I don't know how he feels about charter schools. But the Minnesota charter schools are among the most segregated charter schools in the country. Minnesota does not have vouchers because Tim Walz said no, absolutely not. And as a public school teacher for 20 years, he understands how important public schools are in bringing people of all different backgrounds together, bringing neighbors together and strengthening communities. And the public school is a place where many kids are learning the language, and instead of being excluded because they don't know the language, they actually learn the language and make friends with kids who are very different from themselves. So we're moving in a direction now between vouchers and charters where there's more segregation by race, by social class, by religion, and it's unhealthy for a country as diverse as ours. So I would like to conclude my talk by saying I hope you will continue to stand up for public schools. Do not accept the idea that charters are better. They're not. They're only better when they keep up the kids with low scores. And our public schools are better than charter schools on many, many different grounds. All of their teachers are certified, unlike voucher schools where no one has to be certified. So keep the faith. Make public education a cause in your life. And I wish you every success. And thank you so much for inviting me.
hope you can hear the clapping, Diane. Can you hear that? Okay,
No,
well,
can't hear a
you
thing.
had a big round of applause. We have a few questions we'd like to ask you, and thank you
Sure.
again. It's amazing how I sent Diane one question, and that's what you had was one question. Non-stop. She is amazing, as I've said. Diane, many of our districts are experiencing declining enrollment, and we're struggling with that across the state. The charter schools that are in 43 of our school districts are not impacted by state law. Some of our districts are having to struggle with what do they do, how do they address that challenge. Can you speak to the role of community schools and how can we try to think differently about the whole idea of closing schools and what that looks like maybe in some other places?
Well, there may be a time when, if enrollment is so low, that a school has to close, but I am like 99.5% opposed to school closures unless there is such a small population that a school can't be sustained. I am a huge supporter of community schools because community schools really are addressed not just to children, but to the family and the community. And they reflect the family and the community in the sense of providing what's needed. And if what's needed is a food pantry, they have a food pantry. If what's needed is counseling for adults to help them get jobs, they provide that. So they respond to the community and they provide the community center that in many cases is lacking, where parents can come together and learn how to advocate on behalf of their children and learn how to advocate on behalf of themselves. School boards, and I think it's important to recognize this, are frequently a stepping stone into higher political office. And it's one of the reasons why I'm very opposed to state takeovers, not only because they failed wherever they've been tried, but because it enables the governor to crush local initiative and to cut off the path to political advancement for people who live in the community. In many places, people have gone from being elected to the school board to running for city council or some other responsible position in the community, and then going into the legislature and becoming an advocate for public schools. So I think that the community school, to me, is a very exciting development. There is a small program in the U.S. Department of Education, I think it's something like 20 million or 50 million. They should take the 400 million given the charter schools and put it into community schools to
That would be great.
encourage.
That would be great. If we had some response to that. Diane, I was just handed 12 questions. I don't know how we're going to get to all of them, but we will go with a few. Can I keep you on for a few more minutes here?
Sure. I have to mention just one thing.
Yes.
Which is that when I woke up this morning, I went through all sorts of stuff that looking at my blog comments and so forth. And then I came across a note from Judy Solano saying, "You're on at 9 o'clock," and it was 9:15. And I leapt out of bed and I said, "Oh my God, I missed my Zoom." He was talking mountain time.
I love it. Well, thank you for
So
clarifying.
here we are.
We're glad you're here, and we're very, very appreciative of everything you've had to share. So let me start off with one here. Do you know about, or can you share a little bit about the group called School Board Partners, Our Great City Schools, and A.J. Crable? These are some organizations that are probably funded by some of the billionaires in our country. Do you know about those, or can you speak to them?
Yeah, the city, and there's a different name for it, but it's the city schools, and if you look at the people involved, they're all from the charter sector. And this guy, A.J. Crable, I don't really understand, that's not his name. He started with a different name in Houston, and he's bounced from district to district. He's an entrepreneur. And I won't say anything more about it because I don't want to defame him, but I get asked questions about him from whatever district he goes into. But he's not, as I understand, he's not an educator. He's a guy who's figuring out how to make some money from consulting about education.
Unfortunately, that's the case sometimes. We have 3 questions related to Senator Bennett, so I will just try to cover those quickly. The first question is, what is your response to Michael Bennett being the next Secretary of Education? And that is actually on 2 cards, and I'm not sure where that came from. Actually, there are 3 people who've asked about that. Can you speak to that?
Well, when I think about Michael Bennett as the Secretary of Education, think it's an argument for abolishing the Department of Education. As you well know, he's a huge supporter of charter schools, and he has been one of the mainstays in the Congress in defending the charter sector and defending its ridiculous funding. So I would be very much opposed to him being Secretary of Education. I can think of more and more qualified people. There's a woman in D.C. named Leslie Fenwick, who was the Dean of Education at Howard University, and she is spectacular. She's smart. If you Google any of her videos, she's spoken out against Teach for America. She's spoken out against charters and vouchers. She believes in strong public schools. And, she's my candidate, but, maybe Michael Bennett wants that. I hope not. Because I think that putting him there would be like putting Cory Booker there. Both of them are huge supporters of school choice. And I think we should let the Republicans have that issue. I strongly believe that real Democrats support public schools, real public schools.
Thank you. We're faced with an initiative that's going to be on the ballot called Initiative 138. People feel that maybe the introduction to vouchers in Colorado, it would be putting school choice in our Constitution, I believe. The question that comes from the audience is, what is your best tagline or soundbite against vouchers?
Well, they're a hoax. They're a waste of money. They don't improve student outcomes, and they're very expensive. Arizona is now facing a price tag of $1 billion a year for vouchers. Florida this year will be spending, I think, $4 billion for school choice. We can't afford 2 and 3 different school systems. We need one great school system, our public schools.
That received significant applause as well. One more question, and maybe a few more as well. How do you assess, it says here, the charter school videos, is that videos of the presidential and vice presidential candidates? I'm not sure exactly what that means. Can anybody clarify that? Who turned that in? It says, how do you assess the charter school videos, I couldn't read. How do you assess the charter school views of the presidential and vice presidential candidates? Excuse me.
Oh, yeah, well,
Views.
that's easy. The Republican Party has it as a matter of faith that school choice is the way to go. And they're embarked on a path towards eliminating public education. And they have made this very clear. It's the Betsy DeVos way to go, which is that you pay people to homeschool their children. You pay them for micro schools where a group of parents create a small school. And the one thing that ends up suffering is public schools, even though the vast majority of parents today have their children by choice in public schools. So the Republicans have nothing to offer for public schools, none. On the Democratic side, I'm not sure what Kamala Harris's views are. I haven't heard her. She is a product of public education, so that's a good thing. She went to public schools in California, and then her mother moved them to Canada. And I'm not sure where she went in Canada, but she did go to public school. She didn't go to a religious school. And if she had, I'm not opposed to choice. I'm opposed to the public paying for choice. If you want to send your kids to religious school, go right ahead. If you want to homeschool your children, go right ahead. But don't expect the public to pay for it. That's what I'm opposed to. Tim Walz gets it, and Tim Walz, of the 4 candidates, is the only one who is a teacher and who understands the importance of public schools, and he truly understands it. So I feel encouraged by her choice of him, and on my blog I encouraged her to, not that she listened, but I came out strongly for him before he was chosen. And when I heard that Tuesday morning a few weeks ago that she had chosen him, I woke up almost screaming because I couldn't believe she had made such a wise choice, and he turned out to be a great choice.
I think most of us agree very much with that comment. Let me mention, too, the Phi Delta Kappa poll just came out that said 71% of parents support increased funding for public schools, and 81% of Americans want increased focus on attracting and retaining good teachers. This is good news. And only 35% want an increased focus on expanding charters. So I think you've spoken to some of those same sentiments, if you will, that we're feeling across the country. Diane, my last question has to do with our goal for today. How can those of us who care about the future of public education reclaim our schools as a public good? What can we do?
Well, I think the most important thing right now is to, I guess, just accept that for now, the Republican Party is a loss. They're not turning back under this particular leadership that they have between J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. They're all on board. I think that to the extent you can put pressure on your own senator, Senator Bennett, and just bombard him with emails and try to visit with him, try to talk to him, and let him know that his constituents are not on board with school choice. That would be a big thing to have him flip. I think in every community, in every state, there has to be that kind of constituent pressure. And I have to say one thing that I left out about vouchers. Vouchers have been on the ballot in about 20 states and 20 elections. They have always lost. They do not have popular support. In Arizona, which was the last state referendum, they lost by 65 to 35. And that's typical. In some states, it's even been more lopsided than that. Arizona's legislature, however, being a red legislature, went ahead and expanded their voucher program. So, they just decided to ignore the popular vote. And I think at some point, states are going to have to, I can't even say write it into your constitution, because many state constitutions already say, as Ohio's does, that the state has an obligation to fund an equitable public school system for every student. And then they go ahead and create charters, many of which have been totally corrupt, by the way. I forgot to mention the scandals. And then now they have 5 different voucher programs, one of which is universal. So you just have to fight for it. That's the truth.
Thank you so much, Diane. That's what we're doing today, and we can't appreciate your words enough. You've been wonderful. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Good morning or afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's still morning, and thank you for being here. I was a public school student, and my mom and dad had a 6th and 8th grade education, and they stressed the need for education for me and my brothers. We all got, 5 of us got degrees in higher ed, and I went to law school and became a litigator, a lover of civil rights, and a person who needed to see that civil rights were rights for everybody, not just a specific few. And that's why I'm on the board of directors of Advocates for Public Education Policy. I would like to introduce Milo Marquez. Milo is the chair of the Latin Education Coalition, and is also the executive director of the Latino Research and Policy Center at CU Denver. Milo Marquez.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming to this important discussion. My name is Milo Marquez, and as Manuel mentioned, I am the chair of the Latino Education Coalition and the director of the Latino Research and Policy Center at the University of Colorado at Denver. At the Latino Research and Policy Center, and both with the LEC, the Latino Education Coalition, we conduct community-based research to help support community-based organizations as they push for policy changes at both the state and the national level. Thank you for joining us today for this important discussion and to gain a better understanding of the importance of public education. If you haven't seen the resegregation report or the La Raza report, which both came out of the Latino Education Coalition, I would encourage you to take a look at those. Those are very, very thorough investigations, research, and they both have been published in the past year. Today, we're very lucky, and I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists of experts for joining us today. And I want to keep in mind that each panelist will have about 8 minutes to speak, and then we will open up the discussion for questions and answers. If you look over here to the woman in the red jacket, she is going to be holding up a sign indicating 30 seconds left to speak, and then she will flip the sign over and it will tell you when you need to stop. First, I would like to introduce Kevin Wellner. Kevin is a professor at CU Boulder and the executive director of the National Education Policy Center. He is the co-author of 13 Ways Charter Schools Shape Their Enrollment. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you everyone for inviting me. The book is actually called School's Choice, how charter schools control access and shape enrollment. And given what I was asked to do, I wanted to speak about our work in this book today. There are plenty of other ways that I was asked specifically to look at the ways charter schools impact privatization. There are other ways beyond what I'm going to be speaking about today, and we'll get to some of them in the discussion. But this graphic is taken from this book, and I will be basing my comments on a lot of what we found in terms of our work about how charter schools control access. Ideally, I'd like to touch on the second issue in particular, which is the increased potential for discrimination in charters run by churches or other religious institutions. The question that was asked of Diane Ravitch about sort of talking points about charters and talking points about vouchers as well. I believe that an important talking point concerns discrimination, what I call the outsourcing discrimination. And I think there's an important issue to be dealt with there. Unfortunately, I think that for a lot of people who are pushing for vouchers in particular, the outsourcing of discrimination is a feature, not a bug, so it doesn't necessarily play politically, but I do think it's an important point. Okay, so publicness and privateness exist on a continuum. Within the charter school sector, for example, there are many schools that are way over toward the private end of that public-private continuum. But there are also many schools that embrace key elements of publicness. And among district-run public schools, we should pay attention to that same continuum. Which students are being served? Does the school push away other students through tracking or ability grouping practices, for example, that deny educational opportunities? Through push-out discipline policies? And of course, through catchment areas, which when combined with our unequal funding system, rations opportunities, providing the best opportunities only to the privileged few. So when we think about that public-private continuum, what are the elements or factors that we should consider? One is whether the school is publicly funded, right, or keeping tuition free. And this factor looks good for neighborhood public schools and also for charter schools, and actually for some voucher schemes as well. Another factor is how the law designates a school. As you know, charter schools are legally designated in Colorado and across the country as part of the public school system. But after those two, we start to run into some problems with the publicness of charter schools. I won't go into any detail on most of these, but consider issues of transparency and of accountability to taxpayers. Representative Garcia may have more to say about that. And consider issues of governance, of whether key issues are made privately or through public democratic processes. Those issues around transparency and accountability and publicness and public governance, by the way, I think are witch's brew if we care about avoiding financial self-dealing. There's been a lot of that in the charter sector. But let me switch to the issues around access, which are addressed here in the slide. This is from the book that I mentioned, School's Choice, that I wrote with Wajma Momandi, one of our PhD students. Access issues have major implications for most of the other important charter school issues. Achievement, enrollment growth, transparency, accountability, corruption, competition effects, fiscal impacts, innovation, stratification, and segregation. For me, access is the cornerstone for understanding charter schools and for determining their value in the U.S. schooling system. I'm not going to have time to walk through all these 13 different issues, but what Wajma and I did was we looked at ways that charter schools control access, control who is enrolled in their school before the enrollment process starts, during the enrollment process, and then after students are enrolled. And you'll recognize, based on your own work, your own knowledge, and your reading of other work, a lot of these sorts of practices. What we want to do is bring them together and provide examples of each one to document what's happening. When lawmakers set up a program, particularly a deregulatory program, they should expect people to respond to market incentives. In the school realm, these incentives shape all sorts of behavior about which students to pursue for enrollment and which students to discourage or otherwise avoid. They change behavior about where to locate, about how to spend money, what and how to teach, where and how to advertise, the types of qualifications and experiences for teachers, whether to enroll transient students mid-year, whether to push out problematic students mid-year, and so much more. In short, the rules matter. The incentives matter in terms of how charter schools behave and operate. People running charter schools and engaging in practices that deny access are responding to those incentives and disincentives. Those incentives and disincentives, by the way, you all know, but mainly think about the way schools are funded and our test-based accountability system. And these incentives and disincentives are put in place by policymakers, and therefore they can be changed by policymakers. We don't have to incentivize bad behavior, but there's a dilemma around school choice programs in general. School choice programs are often also called parental choice programs, and the idea is that they allocate educational opportunities to children based mainly on the decisions made by the children's parents or guardians. And there are two basic truths that we have to confront that follow from this reality. First, those opportunities are stratified. In every choice system that I've seen, there are better and worse schools, and the variation tends to be pretty stark. Second, some parents are much more efficacious in working within those stratified systems, in understanding the systems, in learning about the options, in figuring out transportation, in maneuvering through application forms, etc. And those efficacious parents are not randomly distributed. They are more likely, for example, to be professionals who have more formal education and to have time and money to do the research and to provide that transportation we're talking about. They're also more likely to have English fluency. You all know the drill. It's a rich get richer, poor get poorer dynamic with a stark racial overlay. So the same children who are more likely to have a parent who can provide rich opportunities to learn outside of school are also more likely to have parents who will access the best opportunities through a stratified school choice system. Importantly, school choice systems have the potential to do just the opposite, to break the long-standing bond between, long-standing tie between housing and school quality. But the only way that school choice policies can fulfill that potential is for those policies to be deliberately crafted to target opportunities to the most marginalized children and families in a given community. And that's we saw that with the old magnet school policies. That's what they were designed to do. In the charter school realm, some leaders do wrestle with that challenge, but they don't quite get to the point of, do you want me to stop in sentence or should I just finish?
No.
It's actually a stop sign. So let me again just state the central problem. As a rule, the school choice market will allocate the worst learning opportunities to those children who need the best learning opportunities. And that will be the case with any school choice system that does not deliberately, directly, and aggressively change that. The market alone will continue to stratify. So,
Thank you so much, Kevin. Next, I would like to introduce Representative Lorena Garcia. Lorena is a Colorado State Representative for House District 35 and the Executive Director of the Colorado Statewide Parent Coalition. Thank you so much for being here, Lorena.
Good morning, everybody. For me, I'm going to stand because I want to make sure I see all of you back there too. I want to just start off by saying thank you to all of you. And I don't think I've ever felt more intimidated standing in front of a crowd than I do right now. And the reason for that is because all of you sitting here are those who are the experts. I simply have a badge. I work with the experts. I carried a bill. I'm not a teacher. I've never been a teacher. I don't have kids. I don't want to have kids. But I know full well, because I come from an education family. My mom taught in a public school for 35 years. My dad got his master's in early childhood. He ran a charter school for a little bit. He served on the Board of Education for the Boulder Valley School District. And I believe firmly that I had one of the tiniest opportunities of going to what I believe is the best example of a public school in the 80s, University Hill Elementary School in Boulder. The reason why I bring that up is because when I was in elementary school, it was pre-No Child Left Behind. It was before Race to the Top. So my teachers had the ability to craft their classroom and their curriculum to the needs of the students. My teachers were able to adapt their lessons based on the learning styles of their students. My teachers were able to teach about culture and history. We saw the movie Roots. I read To Kill a Mockingbird. When we have seen this dramatic shift from our public school system that was meant for the public into being a system that is highly regulated and dictated by those who aren't even in the classroom, we have seen this decline in the efficacy of our education system across the board. I did have the incredible honor of bringing House Bill 1363, Charter School Accountability and Transparency. In this bill, I will have you know, while we were targeting charter schools, much needed, and we're not going to stop, while we were targeting our charter schools, a lot of the symptoms that we were targeting also come from the residue of No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. When we were talking about financial transparency was necessary, and even after our bill died, did we see and read reports about Texas public school dollars going to fund Colorado charter schools? If I found out and ever saw Colorado public school dollars going to fund Texas charter schools, oh my God. Waivers. When parents are enrolling their children into charter schools, the majority of parents have no idea about the waivers that they are allowing their kids to learn under. No idea, because there is no requirement for transparency. When we talked about the transparency of what are the waivers that should be public, you know what their solution was? Well, we can just link to the Department of Education's website. They can find them there, they can read them there. Oh, rad, okay, cool. So let me follow that. Let me go over here, let me find the website. Okay, now where am I supposed to go? About maybe, let's fast forward about 2 hours later. Oh, I found the waivers. There's a whole bunch of numbers and letters. Cool, I know exactly what this means. The transparency doesn't exist on purpose. Because when parents find out that they are going to enroll their school into a system, into a school where they have requested a waiver to not have to evaluate their teachers, what parent would want to say yes to that? When we talk about the need for space, we had an HVAC bill this past year, an HVAC in public schools. It was vetoed. It cost a lot of money. But you know what? There was always money for capital construction for charters. Why are we okay with investing more money because it's a charter school in their building than making sure that our students in their public schools can learn in a comfortable environment, where our teachers can teach in a comfortable environment? I've been gardening recently. I'm not a gardener. I've been gardening recently. Half of them are surviving. I know, it's really sad. But I noticed, I did this small little experiment. I noticed that the plants that are surviving are the ones that I garden at like 6 a.m. and the plants that are not surviving are the ones that I garden midday. Because it's hot. I know, it's a funny example. But when our students are not in an environment where they are comfortable, where they're too hot to learn, can any of us retain any information when we're sweating bullets? When we're sitting next to our middle school guy friend and they're smelling like BO? No. I didn't mean to point at you, don't say it.
You know.
One of the things that we need to continue doing is not letting up. What we have noticed, and what I have noticed, is we have legislators that enter the Capitol and they get all excited and they're like, yes, I'm going to take on charters. They take on charters, they get slaughtered, they get raked across the coals, and they never do it again. That's their strategy. Let's be big enough bullies so they don't come back. They tried that. Trust me, they tried that. It's not going to work. I already pulled the title. But that's not enough. I want to, in 30 seconds, ask the question. No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top. What did that give us? That gave us Senate Bill 191, excuse me.
Yep.
We can make laws and we can unmake laws.
Please.
Does 191 still need to exist?
No.
Okay, I got my marching orders.
Thank you so much, Laura. Next, I would like to welcome Rob Rogers. Rob is an Air Force veteran, a data analytics expert, and the co-founder of Subterra Insights, where he uses data analysis and strategic insights to inform decisions and to educate the public about the rise of Christian nationalism.
Debating whether or not to stand up, because if I do, then I'll be pacing all up and down the front of this room, and you'll get dizzy, so I won't do that. Thanks very much for having me. There's no possible way that I can explain how I am involved in the education aspects of this in 7 or 8 minutes. So I'm not going to try, but I do want this to be at least an exposure to some of these terms and some of these organizations and some of the activity that's been happening, so you can go and do research on your own. And the very best way for me to start this story is I'm just going to tell you a timeline of events that have happened. But I'm going to go back to whenever I was 5 years old, because I grew up in South Arkansas. And I went to private Christian schools until I was 14 years old when I was in 10th grade. It's whenever I moved to the public school system. Grew up in a Southern Baptist household. My grandfather who raised me was a Southern Baptist pastor. And I distinctly remember, I didn't understand the significance of this whenever I was 5 years old, but the reason why I went to these private Christian schools until I was 14 years old was specifically because consolidation of school districts in Arkansas had started around that time, and my grandparents didn't want me going to school with all the black kids. There's why I was in a private Christian school for all of that time. And also, if you want to look this up too, because this curriculum still exists, the curriculum was called Accelerated Christian Education. I grew up from first grade until 9th grade. I'm sitting in an office. They called them offices. It was a cubicle. You didn't talk to anybody while you were in school. You were working through packets of Accelerated Christian Education on your own pace in these little offices. And when you wanted teacher support, which didn't have to be a certified teacher, you put a little American flag, up on your divider that was separating you, and that would tell the supervisor. There's all these business terms mixed in with like the nationalist and the Christian message during that. This is what my first few years of school was like until I had a real shock to my system whenever I moved to the public school system. I've been involved in secular activism for a long time. Being from Arkansas, you can imagine, what that might have been like. So in 2012, there was a guy named Jason Rapert who was a state senator in Arkansas. All my friends and family are still in Arkansas, so I keep up with Arkansas politics. And Jason Rapert ended up taking a lot of money from the Koch brothers, and he was part of flipping Arkansas to Republican control back in 2012. Arkansas was one of the last states in the South to flip to Republican control in 2012. And as soon as he was elected, he started doing all of these theocratic things. And that's whenever I started paying attention and discovering something called the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation. So does anybody remember the In God We Trust bills were being passed all across the nation that required In God We Trust be put in classrooms? That was because of the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation. That's where I started learning about the more national level organized way that Christian nationalists, what we would now call Christian nationalists, were introducing these ideas into legislative bodies across the country. So I started tracking it there. It's been since 2012 since I was tracking what we would now call rise of Christian nationalism. And over that time, I started recognizing, beginning with Jason Rapert, beginning with the introduction of these bills, I started seeing the intersections between Christian nationalism and public education. And that's kind of why I'm here today, and what I was asked to talk about and speak about was how Christian nationalism is influencing the public education system. So then let's fast forward a little bit more. I've been involved in secular activism. I've been representing people who can't stand up for themselves because it's risky for people, especially in the South, to be saying, hey, I don't really think that a government body should be involved in these things, so I would do it for them. But I've never truly recognized how organized and how networked this was until I got to Colorado Springs, which is where I live now. So I moved to Colorado Springs from Northern Virginia. I had been working in the DC area for about 14 years, working with the intelligence community. They mentioned that I'm a data analytics and visualization expert. That's where most of my professional background is, working with the intelligence community in the Department of Defense. And surprisingly, tracking and analyzing terrorist and international crime networks are very similar to tracking Christian nationalist networks and anti-public education organizations. So it's come in very handy for doing that kind of work. But I moved to Colorado Springs, and I knew that Colorado Springs, I knew it was a evangelical and a conservative type of stronghold. I did not really understand exactly how deep that went and how strong that was, until I moved into the same house district and school district where Focus on the Family is. Though that is, and all roads lead back to James Dobson and Focus on the Family, oddly enough. I moved to the hotbed, I moved to one of the primary hubs in the United States of Christian nationalism, because all of these organizations, there are so many. Did you know that Colorado Springs is the 4th largest faith-based economy in the United States? What do you think number 1 is, just for a scale? Salt Lake City, Utah. That is how influential that Colorado and Colorado Springs is, specifically with the larger Christian nationalist movement. But more specifically, Colorado Springs is right next door to Teller County. This is what's in Teller County. Teller County is Woodland Park, Colorado. The home of Charis Bible College and Andrew Womack Ministries. Okay, so that's where I started really seeing how heavily influenced this was. So then I went through my mourning period, from 2016, until 2020. I was heavily involved in Hillary Clinton's campaign. Didn't really want to be involved in politics, after the events of 2016. Went through my mourning period until 2021. 2021 was whenever $250,000 of dark money was dropped into 3 school board races in El Paso County. $250,000. And all of those extremists that were supported by that money, they all won their races. All of those boards flipped to conservative control in 2021. So me and my business partner and some other concerned parents in the area, we were trying to figure out where did this money come from. Now, we have been hearing about this thing called the Church Voters Guide, which is ran out of a church in Colorado Springs called Road to Chapel Hills. We thought that that's maybe where that had come from because the Church Voters Guide had become so ubiquitous that people were just referring to it as the guide. That's how many people that were referring to this thing. We thought that might have been where it came from. We found out it wasn't really like where it came from, but it started exposing us to the network of all of the Christian nationalist organizations and activity that was going on within our local area. Okay, so now you fast forward to 2023, just last year, and that $250,000 of dark money has now increased to $500,000 in 2 school board races in El Paso County, and they've flipped the rest of the seats. So now Academy District 20, which is my home school district, is controlled completely by, almost completely by conservative extremists, one of which is a instructor at the Charis Bible College School of Practical Government. Isn't that interesting? So then wow, see, there's no way that I was going to be able to cover this. I have a lot of stories there, about how this is all connected. The network is larger than you ever could imagine, and you all have to be aware that you do live in one of the hubs of Christian nationalism. And also be aware that Christian nationalism and Project 2025 are the same thing. Same organizations, same players. It's the exact same thing. If you have any more questions about anything, I would love to talk to you more. My closing comment will be is that you have to fight. You have to address these threats directly. You can't dance around it. You can't change the terms. You have to address it directly. And if you are, you can be successful.
Finally, let's welcome Amy Pritchard. Amy is a social studies teacher at Deer Creek Middle School in Jeffco and the current president of the Colorado PTA.
I'm not going to stand up because I need to see the crumbs from my donut that you almost just. Hi, my name is Amy Pritchard, as was said, and I am very proud to be the president of Colorado PTA. Listening to all of these panelists is amazing to me because, we often talk about how important it is to have things. There we go. That's better. Yay. We talk a lot about how important it is to work together for our public schools. As a teacher, I have seen the value of having parents come together with teachers, administrators, district officials, and being able to craft the solutions that we need for our students. And that power of collective action has been able to do amazing things. Unfortunately, there's a lot that we can't do in Colorado, right? We have the handcuffs of Tabor. We have the, the mill levy, school bond issues that hold a lot of our districts back, that can't get their voters to understand or to afford to be able to pay just a little bit more. And it puts us in a situation where we have schools that can and schools that can't. And, I know this firsthand. I have 3 kids of my own. 2 of them are twins. My oldest daughter is in college now. She was never in a fully funded public school in Colorado. She got all the way through school without ever having that opportunity that it would have given her to be in a fully funded school. When my twins were in kindergarten, I went into school and I was really excited to get them signed up for their first day of class. And I got through the registration table, and the last thing that happened was they handed me a bill for $9,000 for my twins to be able to go to fully funded kindergarten. Because in my school, they only provided half-day kindergarten, you paid for the rest. And as a teacher, I didn't have $9,000 in my bank account. And I just sat down and started crying. Because as I was thinking, I can't send my kids to school. And I know how important public schools are. And I didn't know what to do. But some really nice PTA ladies came over and said, you know what, it's okay. We're gonna work on this together. You don't have to pay it all today. They'll let them show up on the first day, it'll be all right. And help me figure out how to advocate for my own children in this way. And now, guess what? Through that advocacy, we have fully funded schools, kindergarten for all kids in Colorado schools. So, the power is real. What we can do together is real. And there are a lot of things, that, again, not the end of the line, right? We have ballot initiatives now that are looking at the possibility, hopefully the state legislature will come together and take away some of the, 108 that would be lowering property taxes. We won't have to worry about that, but we still have ballot initiatives like 138 that are threatening our kids. When we're talking about, we've talked a lot about vouchers today. Initiative 138 or Proposition 138 markets itself as school choice or parent choice. And what it really is an open door to vouchers, right? It will change our Colorado Constitution to allow vouchers that will come in and siphon the money away from our kids so that we can't have nice things like fully funded kindergarten for our kids. Not only that, it will take away the opportunity for local school boards to make decisions because it gives the control to parents. So as a teacher, I can have a parent come into my classroom and say, my kid, you can't teach this book, you can't teach this curriculum, you can't teach kids about LGBTQ rights that are in the state standards because I don't want my kids to learn that. And as a teacher who has to teach every single kid, I can't put together a complete different curriculum for each of those different kids whose parents may not like this, or may not like that, or may not like something else. And so what happens is the curriculum will be narrowed. Those things will be removed. So it's not parents' choice for their kid, it's parents' choice to inform the education of my kid. And so I hope that you will think about this as the initiative or the proposition that will cause chaos in schools, because that's exactly what it's going to do. In addition to that, I think we need to be really careful because it doesn't mention vouchers. And so there are so many of these things that are out there trying to confuse parents, trying to confuse the public, trying to make us think one thing over here when actually they're doing something else over here. Because the truth of the matter is, as we've heard, and Rob was saying, these groups are organized. They have an agenda. They know exactly what they're doing. I was president of the Jefferson County Education Association when they came in and tried to take over Jefferson County Public Schools. Brad Miller and Ken Witt are still at it in Woodland Park. When we tried to squash them like a bug in Colorado, they just scurried up a hill. And now they're doing their dirty deeds in other places. So what do we do? What do we do when they are organized, they have their playbook, they have their marching orders, and they are out there spreading disinformation to confuse parents? Colorado PTA is the oldest and largest parent advocacy organization in the nation, as well as in Colorado. And we work as a unit to help inform our parents. So when you have a PTO at your school, that you have to think of that as an only my kid. Because PTOs are not organized. They do not work together. PTAs are an association that have local, state, and national affiliation. And so being able to have a PTA at your school is a huge investment in that kind of advocacy that brings parents together, gives parents a voice. Because we were hearing earlier about public governance. In PTAs, parents actually do get to make decisions for their schools. They get to make decisions in their districts. PTOs don't have that opportunity. So when we're talking about what we can do to reclaim our schools as a public good, the first thing I would say is make sure your school has a PTA. The next thing I would say is, making sure that we are working together. In Jefferson County, before we had our unfortunate takeover, we had legislative committees where you had a parent, a teacher, a classified staff member, an administrator who would meet with every one of our legislators once a month. And we were able to have those real conversations about what's going on in our school. We were able to speak with one voice, to be able to advocate. Moms Against Liberty, they don't want us to be able to work together. They are the same people who are saying we need to get rid of unions, we need to get rid of all of the collective opportunities for us to be able to actually address the problems that are facing all of our students, all of our educators, and all of our communities. So when Ms. Ravish was talking about the community schools movement, that's something that PTA is also advocating for. Sorry, it's time for me to stop. But just wanted to say, I really appreciate all of you being here together, fighting for my kids, fighting for your kids, and making sure that we are speaking with one voice. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question is for Representative Garcia. Could you discuss how the lobbyists and their money work to influence the votes versus or against House Bill 13637? Who are they funded by?
Sure. So when 1363 was introduced, and what happens, and I'm sure all of you know, but if you don't know, you can actually go onto the Secretary of State's website, you can find a bill, and you can see who's registered to lobby it. One of our transparency laws in this state is that if you are getting paid to lobby a bill, you have to report it. We noticed that there were 11 separate lobbyists that were hired to lobby against 1363 from Americans for Prosperity. Americans for Prosperity is a group that's behind the school vouchers bill. They're behind 108 and 50. They are funded by the Koch brothers. They are adamantly against public everything. And they start with schools. In addition to that, Colorado also is the home of the Gates Family Foundation. The Gates Family Foundation is a foundation that throws millions of dollars to charter schools and to the pro-charter organizations in order to continue to protect operating in the dark.
Yep.
So, we had probably registered, what would it be, maybe 40 okay, so we had 40 lobbyists who were registered against 1363 compared to, I think we had 4 registered lobbyists who registered in favor of 1363. Yes, Callie. Callie was one of them, thank you. In addition to that, you have what's now flailing in the wind, thank goodness, Democrats for Education Reform, DFER. They give money to Democratic candidates who they believe will uphold the charter school protections. We saw that loud and clear in committee. All those that have ever received a DFER contribution voted no on this bill. They all voted no. We had 3 Democrats on that committee that bravely stood with myself and my co-prime Tammy Story, and she was one of them. She was one of the 3 who voted yes for transparency and accountability. Money, as much as I love to believe that money does not make the world go round, it really does. And as long as we are allowing pro-defer candidates into our state house, we are not going to accomplish the accountability and transparency and the investment in public schools that we need. The other last thing, because I know we're at time, or we're running out of time. The other thing I want to say also is the differences between a charter school and a public school, we saw also come down in committee. Charter schools sent their parents to testify without explaining what the bill was and only told them this bill will shut our schools down.
Yep.
They brought students to testify saying, these evil people want to take your school away. Public schools don't do that. Public schools cannot do that. Public schools cannot send out an action alert saying support X bill or support Y bill. But charters, because they are actual registered nonprofits, 501c3s, have that ability to do so. Anytime we bring a charter accountability bill, we are going to have parents who are threatened that if they don't show up, their school will be shut down. We have got to counter that argument every single time, and we have to be loud about it. And not only that, we have to organize. If our schools can't do it, you are all in this room, and it's not a Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday or Friday. Which means that I know that every single one of you, and every single one of us can organize to make sure that we also bring parents and students to the Capitol. Because that's the only way we're going to win, and we're going to counter that argument that any sort of charter school accountability or transparency is going to shut them down. And you know what? If it does, then maybe they should be shut down.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Rob. How does the Christian nationalism movement impact the growth of charter across Colorado?
If you haven't noticed yet, you haven't figured this out, then classical education is just code for Christian education. So there's one of the examples of how it's influencing. The organizations I've already mentioned before, like Harris Bible College, Brad Miller, who was already also mentioned, an affiliate, an organization underneath the umbrella of Evangel Ministries called the Truth and Liberty Coalition. If you haven't heard of them, you've actually been exposed to them, whether or not you knew it, through the candidate questionnaires that caused so many problems across the state, like last year. It was labeled Transform Colorado, but that's actually the Truth and Liberty Coalition doing that, Christian Nationalist organization. But anyway, they are supportive of these charter organizations because it gets them one step closer to vouchers, which is where you start to see the real Christian nationalist influence happening, because they want taxpayer dollars funneled to religious education. They see vouchers as the way of doing that. But there's a lot of the charter schools, that are in the state too, that are also they're using those code words. They're using these waivers that the representative had mentioned before too. They're using all of these things in order to accomplish that same goal. And that's also where you see the commercial interests and the religious interests start to merge, because the commercial interests want to make money off of students. They see students as a profit generator, where the religious interests see vouchers as a way of funneling taxpayer dollars to indoctrinate students. So I think that answers the question. There's a convergence there between those interests.
So I just wanted to add a little bit to the answer to that question. Yes, the classical charter schools are sort of where religious Christian nationalist movement is currently pushing their ideas within, using charter schools for their agenda. But a lot of you might know about the St. Isidore virtual charter school in Oklahoma that was overtly charter given to to the Roman Catholic Church in Oklahoma. That along with a lawsuit in California and some other movement, is part of a larger national movement to bring church-run or religious institution-run charter schools into every state, including Colorado, that has charter schools. Not because the state legislature has said, let's switch charter schools to religious charter schools, but because they're leveraging several U.S. Supreme Court decisions that have expanded the free exercise clause to essentially say denying a charter, if you're a charter authorizer, denying a charter to a religious institution because they are a religious institution is discrimination based on religion, basically free exercise violation. And what that means is that once one of these institutions is running a charter school, the free exercise clause can then be used again to say, you have to allow us to run it as a religious institution with proselytizing, with religious curriculum, etc. And the next step is that outsourcing of discrimination. If my religious beliefs require me to discriminate against the LGBTQ plus community, then you can't stop me because the free exercise clause says that you can't infringe on my religious beliefs.
Thank you so much.